Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing African American lives. I'm Thomas Michelson, Senior Minister of First Parish in Cambridge. Each week, Cambridge Forum brings you live public discussions of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. Recording the achievements of over 600 individuals, African American Lives is the most comprehensive biography of African Americans published until now. Co-edited by Henry Louis Gates, Jr. and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the work illuminates 400 years of African American history through the immediacy of personal experience. What choices had to be made in selecting both famous and near-forgotten figures for inclusion in this groundbreaking collection? How do the personal choices and circumstances of a single individual shape the contours of a larger history? How has the African American experience varied across time, gender lines, geographic and cultural divides? Here to address these questions is Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Professor of History and African American Studies at Harvard University. A prize-winning author and editor, she has devoted her research primarily to the history of African American women. She is currently working on 2 books, one a biography of NAACP field worker Katherine Johnson, and the second on racial construction of citizenship, as well as completing a study on the history of Lilly Endowment's grant-making to African American religious institutions. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham.
Thank you. I think that bio was kind of old because some of those things, but that's all right, Tom. Tom is an old friend. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very pleased. I think this is the first Cambridge Forum I have attended, so I look forward to coming to some of the others. But I'm here to talk to you about African American lives. Unfortunately, my co-editor could not join me. He is in Colorado today. He had a previous appointment, and so he gives his regards and told me to hold up the front. As a child, I grew up in a household devoted to Black history. My father worked closely with Carter G. Woodson, the man known to us today as the father of Black history. I often heard the words of Woodson quoted in my home by my parents. We work to disprove that the Negro has made no contribution to America. We work to disprove the lie that the Negro has no history worthy of respect. Very few educated people would believe that today. Very few educated people would believe, for example, that most Americans do not believe Black people have a history. When Carter Woodson wrote in the early 20th century, he lived in a segregated society. Black history was not a part of the schools. You didn't have anything like Black studies, especially at a place like Harvard. These were products of the 1960s. And yet, with all of the new research, with all of the new information, that really does stand on the shoulders of the great work of Carter Woodson and the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History. With all that new scholarship, we now know that there is much more we don't know. We now know that there is far more to uncover and to understand. So what better way to begin to explore the depth and the breadth of African American history than through biography? What better way to gain new insight into a far more rich and complex past than by looking at individuals who contributed to the making of that past? At least that's what Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. and I thought, and so we took upon ourselves this project, African American Lives. Now, the idea for the project was Henry Louis Gates, Jr. He had come to this idea because he was asked to look at the American National Biography. I don't know how many of you have gone online and have used this wonderful source, but in using it, what we discovered was there were a lot of gaps as far as African Americans were concerned. For example, Henry Box Brown. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he was a slave in Virginia. He wanted his freedom. He was put into a box by white abolitionists. They made holes in it so he could breathe. And then he was shipped, defined as dry goods, to Philadelphia for his freedom. That's a wonderful story that never made it in the American National Biography, but we do have that story in African American lives. The great black woman banker, Maggie Lena Walker. Maggie Lena Walker was born in Richmond, Virginia in the early 20th century. She had her own savings bank. That bank is still in existence. She was not in the American National Biography. The black concert singer in the late 19th century, Ciceretta Jones, not in the American Negro Biography. And the outspoken civil rights activist and leader in the NAACP in the early decades of the 20th century, William Pickens, was not in the American Negro Biography. Was not in the American National Biography. So we decided that we would have to have a larger database that would include African Americans, that would be focused on African Americans, because we realized that we could not depend on other sources to give the full coverage. Well, that was Professor Gates' perspective. I came to the project slightly differently. I came to the project as a historian who was aware of how much history had changed, both in subject matter and in methodology, from the 1960s to the present. In the late 1960s, African American studies was just beginning to appear in a formal way in universities. And it was in a very political and contentious way that African American studies developed in places like Harvard and in most places across the universities. Even in the historically black schools, African American studies as a department, as a major, what we call at Harvard a concentration, was a contentious issue. Black history, as I stated before, certainly was strong, it certainly existed. But the way that we understand black history today as a field of study, courses in universities, critical to PhD programs, very much integrated within the larger American narrative, you didn't see much of that before the 1970s. Women's history would appear in a formal academic way in the later 1970s and early 1980s. The other thing that I realized is that history had changed methodologically. The nature of writing history no longer looks solely at presidents and soldiers and those people who left manuscript papers to the Library of Congress, or those who had their archives of their organizations in libraries across the country, or diaries that were published. Historians began to look in other types of places. So certainly we looked at the newspapers and the census, but we also began to look at church records. We began to do oral histories. We began to look at scholarship that slave testimonies that really had not been used in this kind of way. A variety of government archives related to emancipated slaves brought to light new names we never heard of before, subjects we'd never read about before. And with all of this, we recognized that there was a new knowledge of African Americans and a new history. Let me give you an example. Most history books begin the story of the black experience in the United States with the story of the 13 colonies. And they start the story with the slaves in Jamestown. I remember when Lerone Bennett, does anybody know his book, Before the Mayflower? It was really a earth-shattering book when it came out. It was a wonderful book about black history. And I guess I shouldn't give it too much credit in the sense that you certainly did have John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom, but the boldness of this title, Before the Mayflower. It was a story that said, Before the Pilgrims got to Plymouth Rock, we were here. We were here in Jamestown. It was a great way to start a book. Well, now I'm here to tell you that before the British settled in what we think of as the United States, black people were on this continent, in these areas that we call now the United States, a century earlier. They helped to build the oldest ongoing settlement, which is St. Augustine's in Florida. So often history books start with the 13 colonies, but in our new understanding of the American people, we really do have to recognize that what we think of as the United States was actually first settled by the Spanish. They settled the area of Florida, which encompassed much more than what we think of as Florida, but it also brought in South Carolina, Georgia, moving west to areas of Texas. And so when that oldest settlement was established, and this is in the 1560s, black people were very much there building St. Augustine's. The entry in African American Lives on Esteban tells the story of a slave who survived the ill-fated effort to settle Florida in 1528. He's with a group of Spanish explorers. They are there to establish this new settlement, and they are killed, many of them by Indians, but he's one of 4 people to survive. And he plays a very important role because Esteban is there to be an intermediary between the Indians and the Spanish. He's very good with foreign languages, and so he's able to be the person to translate. There is a diary of one of the survivors, the treasurer of the group, who talks about Esteban's role. And so we put him in this book so that when you read his story, you see a story that's a very early one in the history of this nation. African American Lives offers its reader the opportunity to explore a vast historical field through the role of individuals. This is a book of discovery. You will come away with new perspectives on history. You will find new things in this book. Now, what are some of the new things that you'll find? One of the things you'll find in this book is the unlikely hero. There are important contributors, for example, to medicine. Now, I don't mean doctors of the 20th century, but they're in the book. Daniel Hale Williams, one of the pioneers in open heart surgery. Charles Drew, the great pioneer with blood plasma. They're in the book. But I'm talking about unlikely people. You'll learn about black medical heroes in the late 17th century, early 18th century. One was named Caesar. He lived in South Carolina, and he was famous for working with roots and herbs as an antidote for poison. The South Carolina Assembly in 1749 spoke of various white citizens whose lives had been saved by Caesar. Because of Caesar's role as a, quote, doctor, there was a special colonial legislature meeting to talk about how to get the secrets from Caesar. And one of the people there talked about how important Caesar was as a, quote, doctor to many of the white colonists. Well, the colonial legislature determined to get these ingredients for the antidote from Caesar, so they asked him, what would he do? What would it take to get this recipe? And Caesar said, his freedom and an annual pension. So Caesar was a smart man. He wasn't alone. In Massachusetts, Onesimus was the slave of the illustrious Boston clergyman Cotton Mather. Now, Onesimus was given to Cotton Mather in 1706. It was given to him by his congregation. And Onesimus then was just a little boy. Mather named him Onesimus. I don't know if you read the Bible, but there is a book called Philemon. And there's a story in that book where Paul is telling the story of Onesimus who he flees to freedom. And Paul tells him, come back. And he does come back. And It's a story from a black liberation standpoint, probably not a good one. But from the story of the Bible, it's supposed to tell masters that they had responsibilities to be humane to their slaves. So, liking that story, Cotton Mather gives the name Onesimus to his slave. And lo and behold, he learns a great thing from Cotton Mather. He learns inoculation. In 1716, Mather, who was very much an intellectual, writes the Royal Society of London, and he describes how Onesimus and his fellow Africans scratch the skin, put a little bit of the smallpox into the skin. They get sick for a few days, and then afterwards they feel okay. They are immune from the smallpox disease. Mather was very much impressed, and so he writes to the Royal Society, and he says, I've gotten this information from Onesimus, who is, and I quote Mather, a pretty intelligent fellow. Well, during the smallpox epidemic in 1721, Mather seeks to use this inoculation method, and he comes under a scathing attack from one of the doctors in Boston, William Douglas, who cannot imagine how any black slave could have anything intelligent to say about inoculation. And there's all kinds of debate. There's a graduate student at Harvard, Margot Minardi, who just wrote an article about this debate between Douglas and Mather about Onesimus in the William and Mary Quarterly, if you're interested in reading about that. It came out this past summer. Well, for those who did take Mather's advice in 1721 and in 1723, lives were saved. Their lives were saved. So these are unlikely heroes, stories that most of us do not know. But what's another thing that African American Lives does? Secondly, African American Lives reacquaints you with the familiar names of unknown people. And I don't mean simply that you will learn more and perhaps new things about people you already know. Certainly the book talks about Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. I mean, what's a new thing about Rosa Parks? Many people don't realize that she was an activist. Many people believe a story, and I wonder how many of you have heard this story, that she was on the bus that day. She was a hardworking woman. She was sitting in the segregated seat that she was supposed to have. And this white man comes up to her and says, the bus is full, you've got to get out of your seat. And Rosa Parks is tired. And because she's tired, she decides she is not giving up her seat. But she's not portrayed as a political person. Rosa Parks was a very political person. She was secretary of the NAACP when this happened. She had worked with people who were desegregating the library, or attempting to desegregate the library in Montgomery. She was not even the first person that year, not even the first woman that year, who had resisted. There were several other women that year. In fact, the court case that resolved the whole story, the court case that ended the boycott, was Gale versus Browder. Rosa Parks was one of the people. There was about 4 women in the case. Well, yes, that's maybe for some of you new information of a familiar name, but I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the names that might surprise you, names that are on streets, names that are on school buildings, names that are on apartment houses, names that you may know well, but you know nothing about the life behind the name. They have no real meaning. When you read African American Lives, the names have meaning. Let me give you an example from Boston. For any of you who may go into the South End, who might drive around in Roxbury, there's a boulevard called Melnia Cass. Melnia Cass has a lot of history to it because Melnia Cass was defined or called the First Lady of Roxbury. She was a black woman born in Virginia in 1896. Her mother died when she was 8 years old. A few years later, she was sent, quite young, to Boston to live with relatives. She couldn't get a job as anything but a domestic servant. She wanted a job as she got older with as a sales clerk in a department store, but she couldn't get that job because those jobs in Boston were denied people. At the time of the First World War, as a maid, she became active with the local NAACP, and for the rest of her life, and she lived a long life because she died in 1978, she left a legacy in the fight against racial discrimination. In the 60s, she was very much involved with the school campaigns. She was very much an activist. And when I first moved to Boston in the 90s, and I would go to church in the Roxbury area, and I would drive along Melnia-Cast, I must tell you, I had no idea what the name of that street meant until I started working on African American lives. When I read about Melnia-Cast, as we put together African American lives, I asked myself, do the children who live on that street, do the people who drive up and down that street, do the people who just walk it know the great person about whom that street is named? I didn't know this great woman, but discovering her reminded me of similar discoveries I had in Washington, D.C. I went to an elementary school in Washington called the Lucy Diggs Slow School. It was only much later that I learned who this Lucy Slow was. She was an educator, very prominent woman in Washington, D.C. And one thing I realized is that in D.C. we have lots of schools, and they're named for a variety of people, many of them presidents. We have Roosevelt High and McKinley High and Wilson High. But there were also schools named after black people. Most people in Washington know Dunbar High School, and most people know the familiar name Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poet. But when I was growing up, I knew people who went to Terrell Junior High School. I knew people who went to Cardozo High School. And I had no idea that Terrell Junior High was named after Robert Terrell, who was the first black federal judge in the early 20th century. He was appointed by Roosevelt. He was the husband of the great civil rights activist Mary Church Terrell. I didn't know that Cardozo High School was named after Francis Cardozo. He was a politician in South Carolina during Reconstruction. He left South Carolina after Reconstruction ended. He went to Washington, D.C., where he became an important educator. It wasn't until I was in college that I realized who those schools were named after. So my story is probably similar to a lot of people. For example, there is a Garrett Morgan School in Harlem, and it takes its name from the great black inventor Garrett Morgan, who was born in the late 1870s and lived also a very long life. He died in 1963. Morgan invented what we think of as the gas mask. He invented a mask that was to help firemen withstand the smoke, and his invention was also used by the Army. This invention carried his name, so when he went into the segregated South to display it, he pretended to be the assistant. He had a white man who was Garrett Morgan, and this white man, pretending to be Garrett Morgan, would talk about this gas mask. Garrett Morgan was always there as the assistant, and he was the Indian assistant. That's how he presented himself. Because of his appearance, he could do so. So these are familiar names for people who go to schools, who ride these streets, who see these apartment buildings. It's important to know who lived and lived a life that made it possible to have that kind of legacy. And the third thing I'd like to share with you is that African American Lives offers a way to explore new paths for leadership. It forces us to rethink leadership by the juxtaposition of different types of historical actors. You know, we often think of leaders in a certain kind of way. If I were to poll you and I said, what is a leader to you? I think most of us would identify leaders as people who were educated, people who had standing in the community in terms of a certain level of social status, Many of us would see leaders as national figures. Those people are in our book. There's Thurgood Marshall, there's Martin Luther King, there's Frederick Douglass, all the traditional leaders, all the people with whom you identify leadership are in that book. However, research tells us that there are lots of leaders at the local level, and these are people we don't necessarily know. But one of the ways we found out about these people is through the recent research on the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement has undergone a sea change in interpretation. When the civil rights movement was first written about in the 1960s and 1970s, people looked at the great national leaders, King, even Bob Moses is a good example of a great national leader, although he's a very different type of leader from King. They looked at Thurgood Marshall. They looked at Whitney Young, who was the head of the National Urban League. Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP. James Farmer, the head of CORE. I'm sure these names are familiar to you. And these are important names. Again, I say they are in the book. When people looked at the civil rights movement, they obviously looked at the presidents, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, at the lower level of the appellate court, Judge Minor Wisdom, great figures that we talked about a lot last year when we celebrated the Brown decision. But somewhere around the 1980s, historians began to look at local level leaders. They began to ask different questions. They said to themselves, how does a movement really take place? Does Martin Luther King fly in and galvanize a whole community? It seems difficult. Isn't there something going on already in those communities? Aren't there people already in the trenches doing wonderful things? And when historians began to take that attitude, they began to do local studies, and they began to use oral interviews. They began to interview communities. And what they began to find out is that women were all in that leadership. Women's voices, women's leadership, missed when you look at these national heroes, missed when you go to the Library of Congress and think you're going to find their papers. But very much the people behind the movements, very much the, that kindling, that flame that starts it going, so that when other people come down, they're not coming down to something that's tabula rasa. They're not coming down to something that's quiet. It's already in motion. Who are some of those people? Well, let me give you some big names first. We all know about Thurgood Marshall. I hope you know about Constance Baker Motley. Constance Baker Motley was just as good a lawyer as Thurgood Marshall. We hear her name, but what did she do? Motley argued many of the important school desegregation cases at the university level. She's the one who argued James Meredith. Did you know that? She's the one who argued James Meredith at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. She's the one who got Charlene Hunter Galt into the University of Georgia. She's the one that got Vivian Malone into the University of Alabama, Harvey Gantt into Clemson. Constance Baker Motley. African American Lives also tells us about women who were civil rights advocates earlier, women upon whose shoulders she stood. People like Motley stood upon the shoulders of Septima Clark. How many of you have heard of Septima Clark? From South Carolina, who graduated from Avery Institute in 1916. She went to teach sharecroppers on Johns Island off South Carolina. In 1919, she returned to Charleston to work with the NAACP in securing employment for black teachers in the public schools of the city. Septima Clark described her activism as dating back to the early decades of the 20th century, and she continued it right until the day she died. Let me read from her words. In 1919, I went door to door for the NAACP, getting signatures to petition the South Carolina legislature that Negro teachers be placed in the public schools of Charleston. We got teachers in 1920. Then in 1956, I refused to disown the NAACP. And I'll say that again, 1918, 1956, she says. I refused to disown the NAACP, and I lost my job as a public school teacher as a result of my activities in interracial work. Finally, in 1959, while directing the educational program at the Highlander Folk School, I was arrested for allegedly possessing whiskey, which was found by the courts to be untrue, and the case was dismissed. This attack was made on me to make me scared, to make me the only Negro resident leave. I stayed. This was an amazing woman. And African American Lives tells us about women like her, but it tells us about even more different women. She went to Avery Institute. Constance Baker Motley went to law school. But there are women in this book who didn't even go to college, didn't even make it to junior high school. Such a woman, of course, is Fannie Lou Hamer. These were women, Fannie Lou Hamer, Annie Devine, Unita Blackwell. These are women in abject poverty. These are women who have very little education at the time of their struggles. But one thing they did have was a long-standing understanding that racism was not to be accepted. They had a long-standing hatred of inequality and injustice. Fighting against that within their spirit was not new. They might not have gotten out there and voted. They might not have had the courage to get out there and risk their lives in this early period to get people to vote. But all the way growing up, their spirits told them something was wrong. And women like Fannie Lou Hamer picked cotton at 6 years old. When she gets older, according to African American Lives, she says, when I got a little older, I was picking 300, 400 pounds of cotton a day. And yet she will become a tremendous figure in the civil rights movement. And I often tell people that when we study the leaders of SNCC, when we study the students who go down and risk their lives and some die as the three civil rights workers did, you have to also keep in mind that there are people that live down there who risk their homes, who risk their jobs, who risk their lives daily. Can't go back north. And these are the people who are the real drivers, who make it possible for a voting rights campaign to occur. Fannie Lou Hamer was one of them. But another person that we talk about in the book is Unita Blackwell. Unita Blackwell is still living, and this is an important point I want to make about African American lives. We are different from most books, most biographies. We are different from American National Biography because we include the living. It's important to include the living because a lot of our history is still going. And many of these people, these giants of civil rights movement, are people who are very much alive. Some of them are in the very last years of living, but they are still alive. And Unita Blackwell is one such person. She was the daughter of sharecroppers in Mississippi. Up until her 20s, she was picking cotton in Mississippi. In 1964, she became a field worker for SNCC. Fighting for voting rights, she spoke out for the poor. In 1976, the irony of it all, she was elected mayor of Mayorsville, Mississippi. She's the first black woman to become, or the first black person, I think, to become a mayor in Mississippi. So these are the kinds of stories that African American Lives captures. It captures stories of people who don't appear in most history books. It captures stories of people who do appear. I'd like to close my comments with remarks from Constance Baker Motley. She has a quote, and she says, "Something which we think is impossible now is not impossible in another decade." I'll read it again. "Something which we think is impossible now is not impossible in another decade." And to contextualize it, obviously, when she was there walking that lonely road with James Meredith, getting, no way to register, and they just did it over and over, and every time that door got slammed until finally they had to go off to a secret place and register him. I am sure, for those of you who visit the University of Mississippi and you see the bullets in the buildings, they're still there, the bullet holes where all that rioting took place around this black veteran's right to go to a school to which his tax dollars went. That story, which looked so impossible in 1960, seems absolutely probable to us today. We can't imagine the University of Mississippi without black guys on the basketball team, without black people taking classes. Well, in that same way, her words capture the bold and unprecedented endeavor that Skip Gates and I have attempted to undertake. We are actually doing something much bigger than African American lives. We have a database of 10,000, we're attempting now, a database of 10,000 African American entries. This is a daunting task. This is as daunting as what Carter Woodson talked about when he said winning respect for black history. Because we are looking at men and women, we are asking for help. If any of you are interested in writing an entry, if you know of someone who deserves to be in our database but who is not in there, I ask you to please go to the website of the Du Bois Institute and you will see the link for the African American National Biography. This is the first installment, and so I hope that you will get it and enjoy it, and it's been a pleasure talking to you tonight.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham discussing African American lives. Well, in your very last comments, you answered the question I was prepared to ask you first. I kept thinking all the time you were talking that this volume must seem like a first volume of a very long set. And now I see that it is, because what you told us about is a field of historical study that is changing as it happens. And that's a very exciting thing to think about. And it must be exciting for you, though sometimes daunting, as you say, to be in the midst of all that and realize that we're now studying a history that didn't exist very long ago. And I'm not going to ask you that question, but that was the question I was going to start with. I think what I'll start with is your very interesting presentation about the civil rights movement and how that taught us to look beyond the large leaders. What I didn't hear you say, but I think probably you would say, is that as you talked about the creation of a new discipline of African American studies, was it the civil rights movement as we know it from 1955 to 1968 that was the primal force in bringing to life a new discipline in African American history?
Okay. Well, you've asked me a question that I struggle with on a lot of levels. Now, on the level of what brings to life African American history, I wouldn't say it was the civil rights movement. I would say that it was the earlier generation. It was the Du Boises. It was the Carter G. Woodsons. It was the John Hope Franklins. It was a generation. You know, when Woodson began the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History around 1912, in 1916, he began the Journal of Negro History. And it's fascinating to me because Du Bois, Woodson, Charles Wesley, who was also very active with this movement, John Hope Franklin, all went to Harvard. They all got their PhDs from the history department at Harvard. And going to a school like Harvard, they realized how much they didn't get. They realized that while they got a great education, while they learned a lot about how to do the craft of history, the type of objectivity you needed, the type of research that needed to be done. What they realized is that the tools that they received actually opened their eyes to how much history was not objective. You know, how easy it was for a great historian like Ulrich Phillips, and he was defined in his day as a great historian. 1918, he writes American Negro Slavery and says slavery is a training school for civilization. And yet, there's a lot in that book in terms of its method, in terms of its information that would be defined as modern as far as history is concerned. So I wouldn't give the civil rights movement that much credit. But what I will give the civil rights movement the credit for is really popularizing these books, really bringing to the public how important these works are and how unexplored they are. Do you know that in the 60s, and a small portion of the 60s, in fact, The Souls of Black Folks by Du Bois sold more than it ever sold from the time it was first published in 1903 up until like 1963. So there was a clamor. What is all this fight for civil rights? What is this story about integration? Who are these people? And people wanted to know. So I think that's what did it. And then, of course, as the civil rights movement begins to move in a way that takes black people more and more to black power. And by black power, I'm not talking about separatism now. I'm talking about the idea that black people have a history, a culture, a will for self-determination, and therefore they want to put that knowledge into Harvard, not take it out of Harvard, but put it into Harvard. But just think how contentious that was. So when those books begin to be written, it's just amazing how many white scholars are involved in this movement. It's not just black scholars. It's amazing today how much African American history has influenced women's history, some of the paradigms, the discussion of women's culture, which was prevalent in the 1980s. It's not used too much anymore, but questions of difference versus equality, a lot of those same issues had been brought up in black history. So I would say that to you, that this information is not just located in black studies. It is throughout the university. However, to say one thing about black studies, it's something broader than history. So it's the bringing together of an interdisciplinary approach, literature, music, language, linguistics even, sociology, government. So black studies is something bigger than black history, but black history is obviously fundamental to it.
Thank you. I want to take just one more step before we open up the microphone to guests in the audience. You said that the development of African American historical study was surrounded by contention. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to just ask how much of that contentiousness persists now?
I don't think a lot persists. Now, I'm sure there are going to be people who are going to disagree with me about this, but when you look at the programs of the historical associations, the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Berkshire Conference on Women's History, the Southern Historical Association, and there are a variety of them. The representation of topics on African Americans is so huge that many people might have a problem thinking that you need more of some other groups. I'm saying that partly tongue-in-cheek, but in the early years, places like the American Historical Association rarely had a black speaker. 1913, Du Bois speaks, because he comes, I believe, with one of his professors earlier professor from Harvard, made it possible for him to speak on Reconstruction, but that's a rare thing to happen. Now, I can't imagine a session, a panel of sessions, where there wouldn't be several Black Studies panels or Black Studies papers within a larger panel. So I think we're represented.
Thank you. I do want to ask one more question, if you don't mind. It's very exciting to hear you talk about the discovery of new sources and resources, and as you're working, you must be aware all the time that there are resources out there that you haven't even discovered yet. It might make it vivid for us if you could tell us of a recent discovery of resources that is very exciting and as yet not very explored.
Okay. Well, I'll give you one that's getting more and more explored, and that's church records, because this is what I used. When I wrote my book, Righteous Discontent, I was told by my advisor, then a man named Eugene Genovese, how can you write about women in the church when there are just no sources? And so I said to him, trust me, I'm going to try to find them. And so I did. I went to libraries, I went to religious denominations, I went to a school that was the school of a woman named Nannie Helen Burroughs, and she's another person in the book, and a boulevard is named after her in Washington, D.C., and I went into that school and saw boxes and boxes of papers going up to the ceiling, and I said to the then president, you really need to get those papers into a library. And so those papers are now in the Library of Congress. I actually helped to process those papers over the summer when they came in, and it's a huge collection. It's as big as Booker T. Washington's collection. Well, that was just like discovering a gold mine. But here's another source. There are universities in the South, and I'm thinking of Duke for one, but I think the University of Virginia is another, that have these oral history projects. And they send teams of students out into the countryside and out into the city to interview people who are elderly, but who were very much local leaders. Some of them were local business people. Some of them were activists in the civil rights movement. Some were important educators. But those stories just haven't been told. So one of the important books that came out of that is a book by David Chichelski called Along Freedom Road, and it's about the desegregation of schools in a particular county in North Carolina in the 1960s. But they're just, when I said at the beginning that the more we know, the more we recognize we don't know, it's because the more we learn, the more we realize that there are names we never heard about before. There are stories that we didn't even know existed. Those stories complicate the older stories that we once had, and it's rich.
You are listening to Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham discussing African American lives. The floor is now open for audience questions. Please line up at the microphone in the middle aisle.
You mentioned that you looked at some slave narratives as part of your research. Recently there's been some attention focused on the narratives and that speculation that some of these were not authentic and perhaps white people were behind these narratives.
Right.
Did this occur to you in the course of while you were doing your research? Has it ever occurred to you before this recent attention? And is it possible you might have tapped into some phony narratives?
I don't think the ones that we look at are the people who, well, remember now, we're not presenting slave narratives. We're presenting people who may have written slave narratives, so we would have to authenticate those people. But you're right. I mean, there were slave narratives that were written by whites. Some of those have been identified. But, many of them were not. Now, the people, some people dictated, their story. So maybe they didn't actually write it, but they told their story. But then, even saying all that, one of the things as a historian you have to be very careful about when you look at slave narratives is that the slave narrative is used for propaganda. The slave narrative is used to end slavery. Now, I'm certainly not a defender of slavery. But one of the things I realized is that you don't capture the whole experience of slavery by just simply looking at a slave narrative. A slave narrative is important. A slave narrative does talk to you about the harshness. But even in a book, for example, of the narratives, and Frederick Douglass has several autobiographies, slave narratives, you don't capture in there how slaves resisted necessarily. You don't see in all of the slave narratives the ways that slaves had loving relationships, the ways that slaves might actually have enjoyed a Sunday afternoon, the way slave religion, how it sustained them. So on the one hand, these slave narratives are really good for certain things, but on the other hand, they have limitations. To give you the flip side of your question, one of the arguments had been early on that we shouldn't use master's records because the master's records would only give you the perspective of the master. But then you get people who can use those same records in very ingenious ways. So one was Herbert Gutman. Herbert Gutman looked at slave masters' plantation records on how rations would be given to each slave cabin. And on one side of the ledger are slaves' names, and on the other side of the ledger are how many blankets, how much fatback, how much whatever the slave needed. Now, many people had looked on the side of the rations to argue either, yes, slaves were treated well because they got food and they got clothing, or to argue, no, slaves weren't treated well because they didn't get enough clothing, and it just depended on what the plantation was. Herbert Gutman didn't care about that side. He looked at the side, just the slave names. Nobody had paid attention to that. Many of these slaves, what did you care about their names? But he did care. He cared about how long the family stayed intact over generations. He cared whether the households were husband-wife under the conditions of slavery, or whether they were single-headed. He cared about the naming patterns. Do they name their children after a father, after a mother? And what he discovered is that more of the families were actually dual-headed than were single-headed. He also discovered that slave naming patterns spoke to a sense of family tradition. So information comes to you by the types of questions that you ask. So the question that you ask, are some slave narratives written by whites? Yes. But even if they aren't written by whites, some of them have problems that we need to look at carefully. Many of the slave narratives that were, they're not really narratives, they were interviews in the 1930s, where the Federal Writers Project, Federal Works Project, went out to interview slaves during the Depression, ex-slaves during the Depression, and these ex-slaves talk about their lives in slavery. Some of that tells you a lot, but most of what it tells you is about the 1930s and not about slavery, because these people couldn't remember back that far. Many of them were 5 years old. Other questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very engaging. And I just have a question that I struggle with over and over again. And I teach African American Studies in Los Angeles, and my students struggle with this too, this issue of the way that the political, intellectual, and cultural labor of African American women drops out of the discourse when the men who are allowing it to drop out were aware of it at the time, and now we have, men and women trying to kind of catch up on it. But how was this justified, or how was this negotiated in terms of who got represented as a leader and who didn't, and what were the gender politics of that? I mean, aside from the obvious notions of sexism and certain kinds of privileging, I would be interested in that.
Thank you. Well, And this is really an important question because, first of all, it's who tells the history? You know, it's really important that people tell the history. If it's not told, one doesn't know. But I'll give you two examples. The first example is the Montgomery bus boycott. David Garrow, the biographer of King, he wrote the book Bearing the Cross, has another edited book called The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. And he tells the story that he was in, I think Montgomery, but he was in the archives, the Alabama archives, and he was looking, you know, up the information about the Montgomery Improvement Association, and he came across this blueprint of the boycott that existed before the boycott. And so he's asking himself, what is this? And what he found was that the Women's Political Council, which was under the leadership of Joanne Gibson Robinson, had actually planned this boycott around a young woman who had preceded Rosa Parks. It was a young woman named Claudette Colvin. And they thought they were going to use her as the case. They ended up not using her as the case. But the strategy was already in place. Everything the women had already thought through. And so when Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat, she was the perfect representation of a respectable woman, what they wanted. They had that blueprint right in hand. So that's a story that would not have been told had David Garrow not found that, done that research and published that book, The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. But the other story is the story that I'm telling you about the Fannie Lou Hamers, the Annie Devines, the Ruby Hurleys. Many of these names most people haven't even heard. And the truth of the matter is, once you read local studies, and a wonderful one is Charles Payne's I've Got the Light of Freedom, because Charles Payne talks about these women, and this is what he says in his study of Mississippi. He says that in this local, in these local struggles in the Delta, the men are not as outspoken as the women. He says the men who are homeowners, literal homeowners in Holmes County seem to be more active. But the other men who are the regular sharecroppers are worried, and perhaps rightfully because they would be more likely to be lynched. But the women are much more like Fannie Lou Hamer. And then he goes on to tell this story of a woman who, and I'm blanking, I want to say it's Ruby Hurley, but I might not have her name right. But a woman who, in the face of ministers who are saying, oh no, don't do this, don't get the white folks all worked up, this woman calls together other women and says to them, you go to church and you say amen before the minister even has a chance to finish his sentence. You sing, my faith looks up to thee. Where is your faith? So she tapped into the cultural repertoire that they held so tightly to, and she changed them. She said, if you believe what you say you believe, you're going to get out of here and you're going to register people to vote. And you're not going to let anybody turn you down, and we shall overcome. She was a pivotal person. I'll give you another example. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the non-voting representative from the District of Columbia. I have to say that as a person from the District of Columbia. But as a representative, when she was in the struggle in the 60s, she tells the story of being in a church in the Delta, and Fannie Lou Hamer gets up to talk. And she says, we've never heard anything like it. Martin Luther King, nobody has any more charisma than this woman. And then she captures the essence of charisma. She says she is articulating something inside of us. And when she stops and sings, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, nobody could do that. Now, that's we've got to tell those stories. I remember when I wrote my book, Righteous Discontent, I always knew that Nannie Helen Burroughs was a good speaker. And the reason I knew she was a good speaker is because every time I would tell people what I was doing, and they were people in the church, they would always say, "Oh, I remember hearing her speak." So I knew she was a good speaker by people who remembered her. But when I was finishing up the book, I finished it in that last section with, I'm not going to get it right because it's been a while ago, but it's something to this effect that this is 1910, and she's on the platform with all these giants. They used to call them the silver tongue girls, or Black Baptist men. She's on this podium with them, and they say what they have to say. And then it said, and then she got up, and it said she stood like Saul, head and shoulders over all the men. It was wonderful. It said when she finished, women were crying, men were, who hears those kind of stories? Yeah, somebody's kind of stories. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to put it, to tell stories in biography fashion. Because when you tell the stories in a larger book, those stories are good, but generally you just tip the tip. When you're telling a larger narrative, a story that's not a biography, you can't take people down the road that just gives them all this biographical detail. So we're hoping to do that in this 10,000 pages. Obviously some people will have longer write-ups than others. And we really have interesting stories. You said something you weren't going to ask, but just to tell you, just little things like, what are your thoughts for here? Who will definitely tell you about Cafe Williams? This is a black woman who dresses like a man, gets herself in the army during the Civil War, and gets discharged as a man, goes back into becoming a woman. You've got those kind of weird stories. Here's another story that a lot of people don't know, and that is that the president of Georgetown University, Patrick Henry, great Catholic president of that university, was black. He was passing his brother, James Healy, who was a big shot. He had a big position. Not just as a bishop, he had a really important position here in Boston. He was black. He was passing. Healy family was really interesting. He had another brother who was a sailor and alcoholic. He wasn't a good Catholic like they were. Patrick Healy would speak to the black community in Boston, in Washington. So while he was, in a way, passing, he was strategically doing this, because many people in the black community knew that he was black. And when it was discovered, he stopped being the president of Georgetown. It's not worded that way. It's worded in the entry that the donation started to fall. So when it's giving out spots, and teach it, and disseminate it, and popularize it. Yes.
You've helped me to understand how incomplete my sense of American history is. I appreciate the work that you've put in over the years on this volume that I hope to read. I wanted to ask you to reflect on the lives of some African Americans outside of the realm of the intellectuals and the individuals associated with the civil rights period. And you must have had far many more stories than you could include in the volume. So I wondered how you picked out amazing individuals, or whether you picked out individuals like whose reputations weren't quite as reputable. Nat Turner, you mentioned in the back cover of your book, Stan O'Lee, who was referred to as a bad man in a famous 19th century. Stan O'Lee, excuse me. Or maybe somebody like Jackie Robinson. And I wonder how you portray the drama of their lives in a page and a half or two. How do you tell that story?
And that is, that's the challenge. The challenge is being concise with lives that are so rich. But we do, and thank you for saying that, because it's not just the noted people. It's not the people who are just all the good guys of history. We also try to get the, quote, infamous. So the Stagger Lee characters are people, who had, they were the bad ones. But even, and bad with quotation marks around them, but even the quasi thief or quasi gangster is a person who's legendary as somebody who stood up against traditional values. And many of those traditional values would be defined as the dominant society's values. And so those people who become the stuff of legend will find their way into the book. Just as people who are like old-time, Oscar Michaud, I mean, he's not a person who would be considered a negative character, but he is a man who is attempting to be a movie producer. And he's peddling his books, and he's peddling his movies, and he's wearing fur coats, and the image of him would probably have been to the more respectable, not the most refined image. So, we have those kind of images. The Cathy Williams would be considered by some people, a negative, cross-dresser, she's in the army. Those would be that kind of image. But probably most of the people wouldn't be that kind of image. I shouldn't say probably. Most of the people would not be that kind of image. And the reason they wouldn't be is because those aren't generally the people who are remembered in history. The people who are remembered in history are the people who made a difference, who gave something to the future, who transformed life in a way that made it better for others. That's usually who the people are who are remembered, and those are the people whose names will come out in history. I think for all groups of people that would be the case.
I wonder if, as you said, we're always in the midst of history in the making, and I wonder if the kind of the broader approach to important historical figures has affected what you might, or the ways in which contemporary organizations document what they do, or are we in a better position to document what community leaders or organizations are doing now that might help us preserve that history in the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, from a historian's perspective, in some ways we are in worse condition. I say that because, when I look at people in the early 1900s, and these aren't, the most educated people, but they keep minutes, they keep records. Unless those records are destroyed, they find their ways into libraries or people's homes, and then they give them. But we live in a time now, and it does worry me as a scholar, where we do a lot of important communication by telephone. We do a lot of important communication by email. Do you save your email? I don't. And I think about this. If you, in the old days, people would save their letters. But most people, I don't think, print up their email and save it the way people saved letters. So I do question how much actually is being saved by a technological world that is not high on paper.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful. And I wanted to ask you about your sources. From where have you synthesized these biographies? Because, previously there are quite a few other books like that. Rayford Logan, for one, Who's Who in Colored America, those volumes and so on. So I wonder from where you're synthesizing, and also what are you adding that's fresh? Mm-hmm. Do you send out researchers to actually talk to people who are living and try to get that fresh information straight from them? Mm-hmm. Or how did you approach that?
Right. Thank you for mentioning Rayford Logan, for one thing. He was an old family friend. He was my teacher, and I remember I wrote one of his, I think I did Mary Church Terrell for him, for the Dictionary of American Negro Biography. Yes, there have been many biographies. In the old days, you had things called who's who of the colored race and that kind of thing. What's never been done, I think, what we are doing is this huge database. Number two, what usually isn't done, at least not in Logan and some of the others, are the living people. The who's who's are living, but they would not be considered biographies in the same kind of way. That's more of a, tell us what your degrees are and what you've done. But saying all that, now I'm blanking on what we do. And right, and it's very important that I have to say this before, because Skip Gates and I can't take all this credit. These are biographies that have been written by other people. We have our own staff of people who also writes biographies. We have communications. People are writing in constantly, and I would hope some of you would do this and say, I'm interested in writing about such and such a person. Is such and such a person in your database? We have a staff of people: Kate Tuttle, John Bollard, Stephen Niven, Lisa Revo, Saul Levy. When you get the book, you'll see their names. I have to give credit to them because they are responsible for a lot of this. We have an editorial board. They have to read over these and make sure information is right. I have to do quite a lot of this. So, for example, for the living, as I read over some of the living, and if I'm thinking, oh my, I wonder if that information is right, I called John Hope Franklin. I did this and said, is this orchid that's named after you the correct name? And it wasn't the correct name. It was the particular Phalaenopsis versus another kind of orchid, or just those kind of details. Yes, we do contact the people who are living to find out if information is correct. What are we adding new information?
Say about Martin Luther King or someone like that. What's fresh there?
Right. Okay. Well, what's fresh would be that scholars who are doing work on these people and who are finding out new information are bringing that new information to the table. You see, so what's fresh would be, first of all, lots and lots of names that you never heard of before, information about people. The one I gave about Rosa Parks, for example, some of her experiences prior to this. For some people, they know this. For a lot of people, they don't know that she had a very active political life, activist life before her refusal to give up her seat. So those are some of the things. There are lots of different things in there. Yes?
You have a very interesting and rich perspective on a very large number of blacks who have achieved something. And I wonder if you think about, though, the situation of blacks generally in the American society today, and whether you're satisfied with it, reasonably satisfied, not very satisfied at all, or on the scale of satisfaction, where are you? And if you're not satisfied, possibly, what could be done to speed things up a little?
There are a lot of things I'm not satisfied with. So let me start off with our youth. Youth, black youth especially, but white youth as well. But black youth especially, I am dissatisfied not only because of the digital divide. I am dissatisfied not only because a lot of this history they don't even know. So one of the things that has been done is that there have been people who have bought these books and have given them to schools in Washington, D.C. We have a group of students coming to the Du Bois Institute on Saturday, and I'm going to talk about the book. They're high school students in Boston. So I'll talk about the book with them, and I'm going to make sure that the kids get the book. These are ways just to educate young people that they have a history. Because on the one hand, for those of us who have had the privilege of having a good education, and that is the upside, that the black middle class is doing pretty well in terms of education. I mean, I'm certain there are certainly downsides, perhaps, but as a general rule, the black middle class is far more secure than it was in 1950. And yet there is a large group over there that is so far removed and has none of this knowledge, all of this history that I'm so excited about, and all of this new discovery that I think is so important. We have young people who don't know anything really about Martin Luther King, nothing really substantive about some of the women like Fannie Lou Hamer or even Rosa Parks. So yes, there is so much in the way of information that needs to be disseminated. My mission is to try to educate. Now, there are other needs: feeding poor people, good health care. I mean, I'm sure you've heard all this, and I absolutely support these things, both emotionally and financially. But my own personal mission is to educate, and I think that's so important. And I see African American lives and the larger African American national biography as a way to tell young people not only that there's information out there that you should know, but that there are lives of inspiration. Just to give you one, Stanley O'Neill, who's the head of, blanking on his, is it Merrill Lynch? He's the head of a big company. Stanley O'Neill grew up in relatively poor conditions, but he has risen. In this book, there are a lot of stories of inspiration. People who head big companies, people who are started off as sharecroppers and now they're the mayor of a city. You know, people who did something with their lives. I think often young people don't recognize that there are so many of these examples out there. And I don't mean to make light of this and say there's so many, when, of course, there's so many that don't succeed. But there are sufficient people who have succeeded that they are role models for all of us. And I'd like to inspire some people, young people especially, with their story.
Thank you, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. You have been listening to Cambridge Forum, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this program entitled African American Lives, recorded in April 2005, or about our ongoing radio series, visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Thomas Michelson. Thank you for joining us.